It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first workshop, which, as a reminder, will be the first of a series of research. We have been, over the last 5 years, working and brainstorming together on a series of thematics which we believed were impacting all our industry. We've been brainstorming on infrastructure and digitalization at the back of the COVID lockdown measures. We've been brainstorming on climate change and how infrastructure could have collectively an impact and influence the temperature in the future. We've been brainstorming on the concept of social license to operate and how we could together proactively engage into discussions with the communities that we serve. We did also brainstorm last year on circular economy and how this is a major lever to also reduce the consumption of natural resources and influence also the consumption of GHG emissions. And today we are starting our research on inclusion and having in mind that our infrastructure are actually the building blocks of our society. So we do have an impact on a daily basis on everybody's life. And we know, though, that there are major differences from northern countries to southern countries in the way people have access to infrastructure, in the way infrastructure are maintained, in the way infrastructures are designed. And the idea of this seminar is to actually brainstorm together with the help of Altermind, which is an academic-driven consulting firm, and which is going to help us engage in all those discussions involving major actors in the market, being academics, thought leaders. We will have industrials involved in this research. We will have also investors, asset managers, and the idea is really to collectively brainstorm. And that was the rationale behind creating Infravision as a think tank, because as the time passed, we discovered that there were actually an increasing number of people which were attracted by that kind of research and brainstorm. And the more we go, the more we believe it is going to serve the whole collective of actors in our markets. And that's the idea of this think tank, which I hope will be a great experience and engage with a larger number of people. I let the ground to Altermind so that they introduce properly the very specific of this research and the workshops of today.
Yes, so thank you, Gwenola. Thanks everyone for joining us on this first webinar. Maybe a few insights on our study and what we're going to analyze this year. As you all know, infrastructure serves as a backbone of all our societies by encompassing all systems, facilities that help foster socioeconomic development. Still, there are some critical disparities in terms of infrastructure availability between and within countries, and revealing a massive infrastructure gap. As confirmed by recent satellite data and academic literature, as of today, there are 9 out of 10 humans living in a country with less per capita than the global north average. 2.5 billion people lack access to adequate sanitation, 1.6 billion are without electricity, etc., etc. Yet, while they can contribute to achieving sustainable development goals, increasing infrastructure provision by itself, only infrastructure provision, is not going to be enough to shrink inequalities, especially income inequalities. The relationship between inequalities and infrastructure is not as straightforward as it seems to be, and that's why we need today and to transform existing infrastructure and design, build, and manage new ones with what we call an inclusive compass. Because beyond provisioning this infrastructure, we must reinforce existing mechanisms and find new ways to support marginalized social groups to create what we call more inclusive infrastructure and leave no one behind. So in this context, the purpose really of this study is to explore paths towards more accessible, affordable, and unbiased infrastructure for all in kind of a very challenging environment, geopolitical, urban, climate, and economic disequilibria. So we have identified a few streams of work for the next few months. We will reconsider the trade-off between equity and efficiency in infrastructure. We will try to find a way to redesign urban areas to make cities more inclusive. Try to restore cohesion with a new social contract. Try to also regain stakeholder engagement in infrastructure projects and refine business models and contracts for more social transition of infrastructure to create more shared value in infrastructure projects. And finally, we will also try to reconcile the ecological transition infrastructure with the need for diversity, equality, and inclusion. This is what we call the just transition, and we will explore that today. As part of this webinar, we are very honored to host three high-level experts, very complementary. We have Laszlo Andor, who is a Hungarian economist and former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs, and Inclusion. And also Zoi Christoforou, who is senior lecturer at École Nationale des Ponts and responsible for transport modules at École Polytechnique. And finally, Sadie Morgan, who is a British architect, co-founding director of dRMM and Sterling Prize-winning architecture studio, and also a board member of the National Infrastructure Commission. So today we will have 3 moments. First, the keynote speech by Laszlo, then a masterclass by Zoi, and finally a fireside chat with Sadie. And I leave the floor to Laszlo for the introductory keynote.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this very interesting reflection. I gave a title to my introductory presentation, which includes 2 concepts. One is just transition, and the other one is inclusive infrastructure. And I think the most interesting part is to explore the connection between the two. And I think if we seriously think about the connection between the two, it will be clear that Europe, which for most of us means the European Union, needs to make some hard choices. There are some hard choices which we are facing, and this whole decade, the 2020s, are actually dominated by these hard choices. Now, before elaborating on the hard aspects of policy making, I would like to take some inspiration from a recent conversation I had with the Spanish minister who is responsible for the ecological transition and the demographic challenge of Spain. Why I'm bringing this fresh experience to you? Because the concept of the just transition indeed is at the center of the policy making, and there are a few outstanding politicians who actually epitomize this collective effort. And Teresa Ribera is definitely one of these. So in our conversation, which also was recently published, she was saying that the Europeans are in general very demanding. And I'm quoting, "We always ask ourselves to do everything very well." And from that perspective, there may be people thinking that what we have done is not enough. But I think that what we have done collectively is very impressive. I think that we have rapidly made it clear that green is a European value and that the social dimension of the green transformation is a European value. So basically, there are 3 important statements at once in this: the commitment to a green agenda, the other commitment to the social dimension of the green agenda, and the claim that Europe has already done a lot. Now, if it is all true, obviously, this is an experience that will be a source of inspiration. But I think we also need some kind of reality check about this European progress. First, indeed, we need to reflect on the concept of the socially just transition and why we need to see this just transition as an imperative of our time. I think there would be consensus in this room about the inevitability of the climate transition, which means that the European economy needs to be decarbonized within the foreseeable future. Foreseeable future obviously means a couple of decades. The European policies have already set specific deadlines, connected dates with targets. And the importance of this is understood, which probably means at the end that the age of coal will appear as a kind of episode in economic history. But before jumping ahead, let's just appreciate that the age of coal indeed contributed a lot to the development of our economies, the productivity, the prosperity in Europe. If I can bring here, because I'm sure you don't know about this, a 19th century novel from Hungary. It was called The Black Diamond. And this novel, which is called The Black Diamonds, is still one of the most popular ones and appeared in many films. Obviously, it's about coal mining and how closely the development of the coal mining was with the development of capitalism and the new stage of civilization, something to be compared to Gwenola in French literature. So economic development, prosperity, together with social problems and the struggle for a better life, was connected with this era of the carbon. But now it needs to be phased out for the sake of sustainability. And most of us believe this is not only possible, but also necessary as well. I think this recognition has been there for some time. Nevertheless, action has been somewhat delayed. And what some colleagues called this became a fast-burning crisis from a slow-burning one. A few years ago, at the ULB, colleagues theorized about the contradiction between the fast and the slow-burning crisis. If you have a lot of time to solve something, you call it a slow-burning crisis. And now probably we have to talk about the climate problem as a fast-burning one. But as you can see on this chart, there are parallel crises, several fast-burning crises, which policymakers need to address simultaneously. For example, apart from the climate and the ecological emergency, we also talk about the social and economic disequilibria, for example, population aging, but also the longer-term energy uncertainty, which is an impact of geopolitics. Again, some authors speak about a global disorder, which has characterized the last 20 or even 30 years. Now, how did the European Union respond? The European Union 5 years ago put forward an emblematic policy, which was called the Green Deal. And I think it was early on understood that the Green Deal essentially as an investment policy. Of course, there are other aspects as well. There are regulatory aspects of decarbonization. For example, when a country decides to lower the speed limit in order to lower emission, that's a regulatory issue and not so much an investment one. Or there are cultural aspects when it comes to changing eating customs. How much meat, how much beef we eat, it all has an impact. But obviously, when we speak about the game changers, the decisive volumes, it's mainly about the question of investment and how we solve it in the coming years, but also in the present time. It is through investment that society takes control over its future. And when this was understood, the centrality of the investment for the green transition, there was a lot of talk about establishing, for example, a green bank for Europe, but that was eventually not needed. A variety of tools, which are also listed here, have been already introduced. A Just Transition Fund connected with the Just Transition Mechanism. The European Union likes mechanisms. A Just Transition stream in the so-called Invest EU fund, which comes from the European Union budget as a kind of a second stage of the Juncker plan that was launched in 2014, and the European Investment Bank, which actually is becoming or has become already the Green Bank of Europe, indeed developed appropriate loan facilities. So seemingly a lot has been moved in terms of regulation, a lot has been moved in terms of investment policy, the Green Deal providing a European umbrella for the just transition. But there are 2 points which need to be made before we go forward. The number one is that even if these financial instruments have been created and launched, there is still an investment gap, which I think we can also call a credibility gap, which appears between the high ambition which we set, for ourselves for the coming decades, very impressive targets occasionally on the one hand, and on the other hand, the modesty of the resources, which would need to be overcome. This is not the only area where the European Union is facing this kind of credibility gap between the ambition and the resources, especially resources that can be mobilized within the EU budget. But this is definitely one of the most important ones. And the second point, alongside the credibility gap, indeed, is the distributional aspect. That it's not only that there has to be a transition, but there has to be a just transition. Otherwise, it's not going to be implemented if various social groups are not convinced that the costs and the benefit of the transition would be distributed fairly across society. So how to solve this? Is this a new dilemma? I would argue that this is not entirely a new dilemma. The just transition concept appeared 4 or 5 years ago, so this term itself is probably new, but the intention to reconcile various policy fields and deliver policy coherence between specific objectives dates back to previous cycles of the European Union. One good example is the Europe 2020 strategy, which was adopted in 2010. It also had a predecessor, the Lisbon strategy, but Europe 2020 was specifically the long-term policy of the European Union to reconcile, on the one hand, the digital transition, which we called the smart growth, and secondly, the sustainability agenda, which was the second pillar of the strategy, and finally, the agenda for inclusion. And some of you may remember that this was not simply a strategy defined in terms of general goals, but very concrete numerical targets. So there was a commitment to increase the share of research and development in the GDP to 3%. There was a commitment to reduce early school leavings in all countries, and at the same time to increase the share of the adult population with tertiary diplomas. There was a complement to a trio of climate goals. On the one hand, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, to increase the share of the renewables, and finally, to increase energy efficiency, also to save. Right, so it's if you look at these numbers, 20%, 20%, and another 20%, you will see that, you know, with the knowledge of 2024, these are not very ambitious targets, but at that time it looked like a very important ambition to set a new direction. And once the new direction is set, you can discuss the speed and indeed subsequently the European Union managed to increase the speed to this direction. But that was not the full set of the targets. I would like to stress that indeed the inclusive pillar of the Europe 2020 also had numerical targets, which was to increase the employment rate in the 20 to 64 years age category to 75 from the pre-crisis 69, and to reduce poverty and social exclusion by lifting at least 20 million people out of poverty or social exclusion. And again, to comment on this, let me highlight the assumption was that these objectives can be mutually reinforcing, right? So instead of speaking about trade-offs, that either you become green or you maintain social cohesion, indeed, the understanding was that through creating green jobs or increasing the green content of all different jobs by reshaping the labor market and the training system, these objectives can indeed be reconciled in the long run. But what we also experienced at that time, that there was immediately a pushback against these targets. So even if something is adopted by the European Council, there can be immediately forces to act against, like as a result of this strategy, the Commission proposed a so-called Connecting Europe facility in the European budget to develop cross-country infrastructure, and the foreseen volumes of that investment were cut very quickly, even before the adoption of the budget for 2014 and 24. So somehow this Europe 2020 strategy faded away. Nevertheless, 5 years ago, after the introduction of the Green Deal, indeed this approach to set long-term targets somehow returned to the European agenda, not with the same fanfare as the Europe 2020 in 2010, but the EU indeed adopted new targets for increasing the employment rate, this time to 78%, to reduce poverty, this time only by 15 million. Although this is an EU without the British, so there is a smaller population, so maybe this qualifies the level of the ambition. And indeed, there was a new type of target, which is to reach 60% with the share of the adults who participate in training activities each year, which means that at the time of the Green Deal, it was indeed understood that lifelong learning should be a reality, and the investment in human capital would become a key factor to implement the just transition. Otherwise, this 60% commitment to the adults' participation in training activities makes no sense. So this is the essential content element in this commitment to facilitate the just transition. You have to provide and largely support from public resources like the European Social Fund all this human capital investment which is needed for preparing people, especially the working age population, for the time beyond carbon. Now, of course, this is expected to be instrumentalized through various national and subnational plans, also paying attention to specific aspects of the social dimension, which is on the next slide when it comes to the gender question. Gender equality indeed has been an important an increasingly important aspect of the EU policy. I think we should acknowledge that at the time of the von der Leyen Commission, it went even beyond what was expected, and indeed a lot of attention is also paid to the gender aspects of these transition policies. And from the data which is presented here, indeed you can have an impression that a sustainable economy, which is based on more the renewable resources of energy, the economy would become more feminine, i.e. The employment gap between men and women could be actually reduced. So in a way, this is another example how the transition to a post-carbon economy could help addressing some of the social imbalances which we have inherited from the previous times. So human capital investment in this transition is absolutely fundamental. But the point is that while it has to be well prepared and well implemented, it's not the main reason for speaking about larger investment needs, because the larger amounts of finance are not needed for the human capital, but the physical infrastructure when it comes to transport, energy, telecommunication. Of course, there are other aspects of the transition too, which require investment, reconsidering housing, reconsidering the way agriculture is performed are also important areas. But when it comes to the inclusive aspects and the fairness of the transition, I think the focus on the infrastructure is indeed justified. When we speak about transport or energy, we also often use the expression network industries, which in reality only makes sense if these networks become complete. And by complete, we mean that they also include the disadvantaged regions. They can reach out to the disadvantaged communities, which is not possible without either large-scale public investment or a very well built cooperation between public and private actors, public and private finance, with which also European countries and also the EU itself, the EIB, which I mentioned before, have experimented in the last 20 years. Now, but what makes the infrastructure policy inclusive? There are two sides, in my view. If you want to kind of simplify it, one side is what we call the input side, and the other one is about the output. On the input side, the criterion for inclusiveness is participation of the affected communities and social groups. And on the output side, we have to measure the inclusiveness on achieving cohesion within society. Just one or a few points on each side. Indeed, there's been a lot of talk when you look at how not only the EU, but for example, the International Labour Organization have been addressing the question of the just transition. There's a huge emphasis on the question of the social dialogue. Obviously, especially in the sectors which need to undergo major industrial restructuring, planning these processes and implementing them is a fundamentally crucial subject for the social dialogue between employees and employers at all levels. But we can also speak about the involvement of the civil society. Recently, you might have seen that the EU implemented a so-called Conference on the Future of Europe, which was based on randomly selected citizen panels. And this also resulted in important conclusions, which demonstrate the high importance citizens attribute to the question of climate and sustainability, and expect the European institutions to prioritize it not only now, but also in the future. Another aspect of the participation I can highlight from my own experience is connected with the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which morphed into the Invest EU, which was managed by the EIB in particular, and it was managed through regular consultations with stakeholders, various social groups, including civil society organizations, which is probably a model that could be boosted when it comes to public banking in the future. 2 points on the output side, because indeed the European Union does have a dedicated policy to cohesion. It receives about 1/3 of the European Union budget in every cycle. The climate objectives, including the just transition, have percolated into these cohesion programs in the recent years. Nevertheless, now the EU is going to prepare for a new cycle, and we need to see how the lessons of the practice can affect the future design of these policies. There are many discussions at this moment as we speak in the EU institutions about this, partly because of qualitative reasons and partly for quantitative one. The qualitative reason is that in the meantime, the EU put forward the so-called Resilience and Recovery Facility against the Corona recession, and it's an open dilemma to what extent the RRF implementation model can affect or even inspire the future cohesion instruments. And the quantitative challenge is that if in the meantime the European Union would achieve future rounds of enlargement, either on the Western Balkans or towards Ukraine and Moldova, obviously in a quantitative terms, these cohesion tools would need to be recomposed, and that again would raise very serious distributional issues across the EU member states. Now, before coming to kind of political conclusions, not only policy conclusions, I would indeed stress that there are many dimensions now, partly the age question, but also the professional and also the territorial, which means that if this new Green Deal approach is to continue at the European Union level, the fairness aspects would need to be strengthened even further. We would need to look at how the cohesion policy, which I just mentioned, could be better fine-tuned to target the disadvantaged regions or even micro-regions which face the specific challenges, and what kind of social investment strategies would need to be further developed to invest in human capital and prepare everyone for competitive jobs in the future. If needed, obviously, we can talk about social investment, because that concept also has gone through a kind of evolution. But now I think indeed there has to be again a connection between the commitment to social investment and the climate transition. I would like to write quickly some final points on the political challenges. Why? Because the just transition cannot be seen purely as a technocratic exercise. It's not an office job for a few bureaucrats in Brussels and the national capitals, but this needs to be some kind of collective action of our societies. And from this point of view, how the public opinion views the question of climate and decarbonization is obviously a crucial issue. I must say that even if all these important policies and tools have been born at the European Union level in the recent decade or half decade, politically speaking, the situation might not be easier now than 5 years ago. Maybe the situation is the opposite. It might be that at the time of Greta Thunberg, before Corona, there was more attention and more public enthusiasm, including in the young generation, for climate. There was indeed a feeling that Europe is leading in this field after hosting important climate summits, one in Copenhagen and then a very important one in 2015 in Paris. But there might also be a feeling now that there is a kind of counter movement. A lot of people, various political forces, questioning the centrality of the just transition agenda and trying to soften the commitment to the transitional objectives. On some of the technologies, definitely Europe falling behind. On some of the green technologies, China or other countries becoming the leaders, which signals indeed a kind of competitive disadvantage, which might be in fact increasing on the European side, and that would need to be taken very seriously and considered to be a matter of a new industrial policy of the European Union. The US is leading on this field. The US 2 years ago put forward their own Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation reduction, but a lot to do with a subsidy race and subsidies, especially in the development and maintenance of green industries. And if the Europeans cannot invent their matching instruments in this period, the competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis China will just increase, and the opportunities to reconcile prosperity, a European social model, and the just transition will certainly weaken. So I should conclude with 3 points, which I hope you will find consistent with my presentation. Number 1 is that despite all these challenges, exactly because of this global competition, the European Union must not allow any kind of distraction from the green agenda, and its commitment should not weaken, rather strengthen. But secondly, like Teresa Ribera said, we also need to insist on the fairness dimension of the climate policies. And number 3, exactly to promote the infrastructure investment capacity, we further need to develop also the financial tools to ensure that we do not only talk the talk regarding the climate transition, but also walk through the necessary amount of investment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you found this presentation useful for the next part of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Laszlo. That was for this fantastic insights. Maybe a few questions in the room.
Anyone for a question?
Yeah, I do have one. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially the conclusion, because when we talk about the new fair deal, we do not talk only about policy, but also about politics, especially in the context of the coming European election. So I don't want to be too controversial, but do you really think there is still a space for such a deal in the European context? And what would be your number 1 recommendation to civil society and private sector to foster that transition? Thank you.
Well, first, of course, we would need to see the outcome of this European Parliament election. There are indeed forecasts, but I must say that the latest forecasts I saw, so to speak, contradict the general expectation in terms of a very clear benefit on the side of political forces which are on general Eurosceptic or even Europhobic. and consequently also perhaps skeptical about the EU policies in the field of climate change. So there is still a kind of variation which expected as compared to the previous patterns. But the point is that the minimum program should be a kind of consolidation of the existing policies and avoid a rollback. It's very difficult to define what kind of increased ambition could be outlined at this moment. I think if the European Union can stick to what was foreseen for 2030 and 2050 in terms of arriving to the climate neutral position of the economy, it might be the case that inherently European forces, but also in cooperation with the global ones, would be able to put pressure on the climate skeptics in the European Union. Let's appreciate that also the United States went through a period when there was a huge amount of climate skepticism also on the top of the US politics, and then shortly after they came back with the IRA, which indeed not only maintained but doubled the ambition of the US on the field of sustainable industries and climate related technologies. So I think we should not be too kind of gloomy and negative before we see the amount of the challenge, and then if we see the amount of the challenge, it should not frighten us. What civil society can do, I think, to energize the campaigns which would stress that the climate problem does not solve itself, right? So it's just because we have bumped into certain hurdles. To be honest, I haven't mentioned the war in my talk, but that's definitely one hurdle, right? Which disrupted the energy markets in Europe, created a completely new experience in energy price hikes. At least this generation did not experience this, and the energy markets have been revamped, but this can still be met with innovative solutions instead of abandoning. I think it's very important to criticize those reactions when somebody decides to react to the gas price by going back to coal, or opening the doors to deforestation, because there have been some examples like this, but this would need to be obviously pushed back and stamped out if possible.
Thanks a lot. Anne, you have a question, I think.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Hello, Laszlo. I had a question on the potential changes and shifts in the institution. So I think you've touched upon this. Another question I would love to raise is, according to you, will welfare states be able to face the growing expenses that are linked with the just transition?
I think a critical aspect of this is whether we can maintain high employment, because I think the welfare state in most European countries is a contributory welfare state, and as long as the working age population has job opportunities and we can maintain this high level of employment, then the contributions are possible. So it's and the from the funding side, the welfare state would not experience big shocks. So it's very interesting how these EU targets, which I pointed to, indeed manage to drive the ambition of the employment rate even higher. And the critical question, of course, is not so much the amount of jobs, but the quality of the jobs. That would be I think a separate discussion. So I think that's one aspect. The most sensitive aspect of the welfare state, I suppose, is the question of the pension. And given the change of the dependency ratios, indeed, the capacity of the active population to sustain the well-being of the elderly population. There's a huge challenge in long-term care, so not simply health care, but also long-term care, where the EU has started to develop some policies. Probably it's in a kind of early stage, but that's where it might be an interesting one. What kind of efforts are made in the next stage, not least because this is also connected with immigration to the European Union. Many of the long-term care jobs, which are essential components of the well-being of the elderly, are performed by people with migration background or recent migrants. And if there is more political support for the anti-immigration parties, then maybe unintendedly they make it harder to take care of the elderly. And I think these aspects also would need to be openly discussed and put forward when countries individually or the European Union as a whole discusses economic migration in the coming period. Sometimes the question of migration is reduced to some situations of refugee arrivals, which of course is an important issue for the safety and the security of these refugees. But this is always just a minority of the total migration. And there's less attention to the total migration, which is driven by the economic aspects. And one important economic consideration behind this is the capacity to sustain the welfare state.
Thank you, Laszlo. Thank you for this great presentation on the just transition. Maybe we'll go through our masterclass on inequalities and road transportation by Zoi Christoforou.
Okay. My camera is on. I don't know why. Something went wrong here. But let's start. So my presentation would be focusing on transportation infrastructure, because transportation is my field of expertise, but also because transportation infrastructure accounts for 1 to 5% of the national GDP worldwide. And also transportation is responsible for 25% of the total EU greenhouse gas emissions. And also it is responsible for as much as 25% of the global energy consumption. So transportation can significantly contribute to an inclusive and just transition, but if and only if certain challenges are appropriately addressed in order to unlock the full potential of transportation infrastructure. So in what follows, I will be discussing certain of these challenges that I believe are very, very important. So let's start in the next slide with a small reminder of what sustainability is. Sustainability is based on 3 pillars: the economic, environmental, and social. So if a project addresses goals related to the environment and the economy, then it's called viable. If it addresses goals related to social and environmental aspects, it's called bearable. And if it addresses goals related to economic and social aspects, it's called equitable. So sustainability is on the intersection of those 3 pillars,
And it's rather clear, I think, to everybody how economic and environmental goals are achieved, because with time we have developed a set of very rigorous indicators allowing us to assess the economic and environmental performance of a project. But to be honest with you, to me it was a little bit difficult to understand what social is about. So social sustainability involves a focus on the well-being of people and societies. To achieve sustainability, it is necessary to overcome poverty and inequality, discrimination, exclusion, lack of access to resources, insecurity, as well as poor governance. So, social is a pillar of sustainability and inclusion is a pillar of social. Inclusion beyond equality, where everyone benefits from the same supports, beyond equity, where everyone gets the support they need, even beyond justice, where the causes of the inequity are addressed. Inclusion is when people are all valued and involved and no one is left on the outside. So road transportation, and in particular highway transportation, can indeed be a real vector for social sustainability. And this is conferred by many analysts at all levels, from the most macroscopic one to the most microscopic one. So I will showcase this by two examples, starting from the macro level and going to the micro level. So here we have a study where the analysts gather data on both the inequalities and the funding for road infrastructure. So on the left-hand side, you can see in orange how the income of the bottom 50% of the poorest is declining over the years. And in blue, you can see how the total income of the top 1% is rising over the years to reach 20% of the total national income. So inequalities are indeed rising. And on the right-hand side, you can see that important investments have been made for both construction and maintenance of road infrastructure, but still there is room for improvement, as we can see that a significant funding gap still exists. So the authors here of this study, they tried to combine those two variables, and they found a very strong correlation between the two that we can see on the next slide. So the results are on this map, where we can see for each state of the US the correlation, and in red we can see the relationship where rising inequality can be attributed to underinvestment in highways over one decade from 2000 to 2010, whereas in blue color, we see the inverse condition where inequalities were reduced thanks to strong investments in highways. And markedly, this relationship was found to be stronger with inequality at the bottom 40% of the income distribution. Let's turn now to the microscopic level from an individual perspective, and let's discuss people with disabilities. So at the micro level, we have a very well-established know-how about the specifications and the adjustments to be made on pre-existing infrastructure in order to meet the specific requirements of people with disabilities. And indeed, over the last 3 decades, significant investments have been made. And today we can say that in most Western countries, most of the transportation infrastructure is adapted to the needs of people with disabilities. Of course, there is still room for improvement. For example, not all car models are adjustable to their needs. They are costly, and parking facilities are not always available at the end of their trip. So this comes to underline the need for a door-to-door design of the system and of the operations, because users actually shape their decisions thinking from a door-to-door perspective and not only being limited to the perimeter of the infrastructure. So turning now to cities, here the equation becomes much more complex because we have higher population and building densities. The intensity of activities, economic activities also is higher. We have stronger inequalities and environmental concerns and many more constraints. So in this case, we have a lot of exclusions. Some of the often excluded groups are pedestrians, first and foremost, even if all trips have a walking leg, and we are all potentially at some point pedestrians. A second excluded group is low-income groups, but we know they are major low elasticity urban transportation consumers. Often we do not think about children as consumers of our service, but in fact their preferences come to shape adult decisions who are our real clients. And another often excluded group is seniors, who are becoming the most important market segment in the years to come. Future projections say that by 2015 in the Western world, we will have as much as 30% of people aged over 60. And we are now far away from the obsolete stereotype of seniors just going out for medical visits. Today, people over 60 are physically fit, they are economically active, and they commute to work during peak hours just as any other commuter. So there are specific needs that may be related to technology, infrastructure, or service provision should be accounted for. On this topic, Japan is really pioneering because culturally speaking, Japanese have a very high esteem and respect towards the elderly. So they are highlighting certain specificities of these age groups, such as the need for more restrooms when we design public transportation systems. So in a recent research we had in my laboratory, we tried to see if this is also true in Europe. And here you can see the passenger flow volumes over time. In blue, it's the total passenger volume, and in red, it's the over 60 years old passenger volume in a major hub in Athens, Greece. On the left-hand side, it is the graph that corresponds to the ticketing area. And on the right-hand side, you can see the same thing, but for the restrooms. So on the left-hand side, we can observe exactly what the Japanese are saying, that already a very big part of the passenger flow are aged over 60, and that hourly fluctuations of this volume follow exactly the trend of the total volume. So they do not have any specificities in terms of travel patterns. On the contrary, on the right-hand side, we see that there is some difference concerning the restrooms, where we see that they are overrepresented, meaning that they use more frequently the restrooms, and they even have different time patterns. So what is happening in Japan is already happening in Europe as well. A second group that is often overlooked are non-locals, and here I mainly refer to tourists that are not even included in travel surveys. So we are not even aware of their specific needs. And this is really problematic in touristic cities such as Paris, where we have over 1 tourist arrival per second. This means over 30 million tourists per year. And in addition to that, we have many business trips. We have special events such as concerts or sport events such as the oncoming Olympic Games. And I regret to tell you that we do not have, that we have not developed a model, an Olympic-specific model to predict the demand during the Olympic Games. Now, from a supply perspective, no, I haven't, sorry. From a supply perspective, transportation system is not adapted in terms of data, okay, but also information provision, both pre-trip for tourists to plan in advance their travels and also en route, because when they are already traveling, they need to have information on service disruptions, disturbances, strikes, and other events in order to adapt their route. Finally, pricing policy is not adapted to their needs. We mainly see them as victims rather than clients. So, of course, there are many problems resulting from exclusion and that concern the excluded groups, but not only. All parties and stakeholders involved have negative impacts that come from exclusion. So if we do not have public acceptance, it's well known that a project may not be delivered on time or may not meet the operational and marketing targets. We may encounter difficulties in negotiation with public bodies and authorities that receive the pressure from the public opinion. We may also lose profits from important market segments, or the competitors may take over the market entirely. And that's exactly the case for the first case study I would like to show you, the case of Autolib, which was a fleet of shared electric vehicles in Paris, France. And here, the failure was attributed mainly to the pricing scheme. And I would like to start with this story because I think we can learn a lot from our mistakes. Even if it's an unsuccessful story, I think it deserves being told. So Autolib was proposed by Bolloré Group to the city of Paris, and there was an initial concession agreement for 12 years. This happened back in 2011. Unfortunately, it was a very financial failure, and the service stopped earlier, only 7 years after it was launched. So the pricing policy is at fault, and this was understood early enough, and in the space of 6 years, and as you can see on this table, the operator of Autolib revised the pricing policy 3 times. So here you can see an indicative price for the annual enrollment, annual subscription that is rather expensive in my opinion. And then it's a pay-as-you-go scheme. For the first half hour is charged from 5 to 7 euros, the second half hour from 4 to 7, and so on. In addition to that, daily, weekly, and monthly passes were proposed, but they were again rather expensive. So we can see that that in this pricing scheme, the excluded group is certainly the low-income Parisians. However, investments continued because the service was progressively through the years expanding in terms of stations for rental, for charging, and in terms of vehicles. And the subscriptions grew, as we can see on the table on the right-hand side. From 2012 to 2016, we went from something like 19,000 subscriptions to over 130,000. However, this was not enough. Demand grew slower compared to the investments, and actually Autolib never broke even during the operations. In my opinion, this is mainly due to, and not only my opinion, it's a general, I think, finding to the pricing scheme, because low-income groups, I repeat, they were not attracted, as they could easily do the same trip, even in more comfortable way, without driving, by taxi or by a Uber. So if we compare the figures from May 2013 to May 2017, we can indeed observe an increase in annual subscriptions, but there was a decline in usage, meaning that each person, each user, was using less the service during the year. We had less rentals per user. Another element of interest is the fact that most of the users were companies. So this means that companies signed a contract with Autolib, and then it was up to their employees to use or not this contract. After studies show that the typical user profile were high-income people residing in Paris or the western suburbs of Paris, and using the service for professional purposes. Very few individuals subscribe to the service and used it only occasionally for very specific reasons, such as carrying heavy objects or going to specific destination points in the metropolitan area of Paris that are very poorly served by public transport. So the decline in usage can be seen in all of the graphs and the figures about this service. And I remember very well this period because it was like in July 2018 when we left for vacation, for summer vacation, and the city was full of Autolib cars. And when we came back in August, there was no Autolib car in Paris. Instead, the streets of Paris were invaded, really invaded, by free-floating e-scooters, which is another type of fleet free for rental, and it's the second case study I would like to discuss today. Here, the reason of the failure, because it's again a failure, is not that clear. So we talk mainly about the systemic failure, and we will try to find out the main reasons for this failure. So e-scooters gained quickly popularity because all people had very high initial expectations about them. We expected them, and personally, I still expect them, to alleviate congestion, reduce delays, to answer the first and last mile problem. And compared to public transport, they offer to users more efficiency, flexibility, comfort, social distancing under COVID period. And compared to bicycles, they are more convenient as they are less heavy, they need less space to move and park, and they do not need physical effort. So these were the main reasons for the fast expansion of the free-floating e-scooter fleet that went from 15,000 in 2018 to 40,000 vehicles in late 2019, in the space of 1 year practically. And we had as much as 12 different operators operating in the city of Paris. The cost of this ride was low, €1 to unlock the vehicle, and then 0.15 euros per minute of rental. 5 years later, e-scooters also disappeared in 1 day from the city of Paris, following a referendum that was organized by the mayor of Paris that showed that 90% of the Parisians opposed to the new service. So after studies showed that people who participated to this referendum, it was a very low participation rate, were mainly people over 60 years old that were excluded from the design of the system and of the operation. So they didn't like e-scooters because they think that pedestrian safety is at risk. Road usage is chaotic, and indeed it was. There were many nuisances to residents, and they raised very serious environmental concerns about the lithium-ion batteries those e-scooters are using. And I would add that the very short lifespan, the first generation of e-scooters had a lifespan of only 28 days. 28 days. So after 28 days, and with no recycling scheme afterwards, we just discarded the scooters and bought new ones. So indeed, environmentally speaking, there is some concern. So at the time, we undertook a survey, and here we can see the impact of age. And indeed, we find that beyond the age of 45, e-scooters are not very popular. The main segment, age segment of interest for e-scooters was from 18 to 30 years old and mainly male. Those who are aged over 25 seem not to use free-floating e-scooters, but they are e-scooter owners. They own their own. They have their own vehicle, so they are not clients of this service. Here, we have seen that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So after this study, we were interested to study 2, please, next slide. We were interested in further analyzing the spatial distribution of the demand, and this time in Bordeaux. I would like to highlight the fact that the spatial distribution of the demand in such cases is crucial to the success of the system, because we have to redistribute empty vehicles, be it autolib cars or scooters, fully charged vehicles at the point where the demand is being created, at the exact time and space where it is being created, because otherwise we won't meet the demand. So here we try to link microscopic to macroscopic characteristics from individual trips at a microscopic level to district socioeconomic characteristic at the macroscopic level. So you can see on the right-hand side, the city of Bordeaux and the income distribution of the city of Bordeaux per district. Red colors mean high income, whereas yellow colors mean low income. I think we missed a slide. Can you turn to the previous one, please? Thank you. So here we see, we try to link age to district characteristics. So we see that we observe on the map on the left-hand side, it's the result of our study, the increase of trip arrivals as a result of a 10% increase of individuals aged 25 to 39. And we see that this is very strong, from 32 to 36% all over the southern district, independently to income. So the age factor here is more important compared to the income factor. However, if we look deeper, we can also identify the impact of the income. Here we see on the left-hand side the increase of trip arrivals as a result of €1,000 increase in average annual income. And we see that this increase is much higher in the district where, on the right-hand side, we see low income, and it's much lower in the district with high income. A third study we undertook concerned another often excluded group, tourists. So here we took 4 European cities, Paris, Bordeaux, Malaga, and Hamburg, with very different characteristics in terms of population, area, density, and of course, touristic flows, with Paris being the most touristic one. And we studied in detail all of the trajectories of all scooters during a 2-month period using the GPS data that are available directly from the vehicles. We were able to distinguish between locals and tourists by using the nationality of the credit card that was used to unlock the vehicle. One thing we find, and it's really astonishing, it's on the left-hand side, where we see Paris and Malaga. I remind you, Malaga is not very touristic, and we see everywhere in blue color the locals, and in orange the non-locals. We see that both in Paris and Malaga, half of the demand comes from tourists. So it's a very, very important part of the market. A second observation we can make, it's for Bordeaux and Hamburg, where we have lower percentage of touristic flows, is that they do not, the time patterns, because it's a day-per-day demand, what we are seeing, are not the same for locals and non-locals. Take, for example, September 26th for Bordeaux. It's a peak for local demand, but it's not a peak for the touristic flows. So we have different time and space patterns. We also have essentially different dynamic characteristics. Here we see on those three graphs, always in blue are the locals and in orange the non-locals. We can see the frequency distributions for the trip length, the trip duration, and the speed developed by each group. And we can easily see the difference when, let's, for example, take speed, where the average speed for tourists is around 13 kilometers per hour, whereas the average speed for locals is around 18 kilometers per hour, which is a significant difference. So to sum up this presentation, I strongly believe that transportation infrastructure can act as a vector towards a just transition and sustainability. However, there are certain attention points that need to be addressed appropriately. The first is to collect inclusive data, meaning to ask all groups of users and also non-users that could potentially be attracted by the service. The second point is to design client-oriented infrastructure, considering the door-to-door trip and not only the perimeter of our infrastructure. And the third point is to operate inclusively with the design and implementation of intelligent, customized pricing policies, services, and information provision systems.
Thanks a lot, Zoi. That was very interesting. Maybe I have one question. If you had to change something, to do something differently, in the case of Autolib and or e-scooter, what would have you done in priority to make it work?
For Autolib, it's easy to change the pricing policy to provide some specific reductions. I'm not saying to do it as the rail operator, where it's chaotic. There are as many products and services as clients, but at least try to customize to specific groups, lower income groups, students that are not motorized and could be a very good client for Autolib services as they do not have cars, and adapt the pricing policy to the needs of different market segments. Whereas for e-scooters, I think that the city could have regulated better the usage of e-scooters and, for example, reducing their number or implementing rules to protect people that feel threatened by e-scooters, particularly the elderly and the pedestrians. I think could have gained the public acceptance needed for the system to stay in place.
Okay. Now, I see you have raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, it was. Thank you very much, Zoi, for your presentation. And I was really interested about the case study on e-scooters in Paris, because we spoke about it with my friends, such as we used to use e-scooters to go out. And I had a general question about how we can reconcile the needs of the young generation and the needs of seniors to achieve the just transition, so no one is left behind, and to maybe in the future don't prohibit something and ban it from the city.
So thank you for this question. It's a philosophical question, more or less, because it covers all aspects of everyday life. It's not only about the scooters. So it's a very difficult question that remains open, in my opinion. But in the case of scooters, I could think of many rules that could have been implemented to protect all users. For example, the parking that is being very chaotic, and to have designated areas even more than the ones that existed at the time, and far away from residential areas where people may need to sleep at night. But at the proximity of bars or restaurants where young people go out go to often, I think this wouldn't be a problem. So the idea of just asking them, starting from a travel survey, but also addressing elder people that do not use the service, and not only the users of the service, would be the starting point to collect the data, understand why they didn't like it, and then make informed decisions on what measures to implement to protect them in order not for them to feel threatened.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe what I find very interesting is during our past studies, we always analyzed infrastructure in relation to mega trends such as digitalization, circularity, climate from a very global and macro point of view. In this case, I don't know what you think about that, Zoi. I believe if you want to grasp the full extent of the relationship between inequality, inclusion, and infrastructure, you must go way deeper. You must be way more granular in the analysis. If you don't do that, you miss a lot of points. You miss a lot of dimensions of this. And I believe that it will be one of our key the key requirements to make a good study. Do you concur? What's your insight on that?
Yes, of course, it's an ongoing issue, because for Paris it's over, but everywhere else we still have scooters, and it's still an open question, and we are still trying to keep up with reality, both researchers and politicians, because reality goes much faster than we are. So we have, and even technology goes faster, as it's the case for artificial intelligence. So we are in a similar context, and we have to keep pace with mobility trends and all of the evolutions that are taking place. So we do not have, it's not like Autoliv, that's a service that ended and we can draw conclusions and make after studies, because the e-scooter phenomenon is still evolving.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. And maybe for our last moment of this first webinar, I will leave the floor to Gwen for the fireside chat with Sadie on inclusive design. Maybe Sadie, if I can ask the first question, what's your take, listening to what has been said at this stage, what's your take on this webinar and your maybe global overview and vision of the subject and of our study? And then I give the floor to Gwen.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I've really enjoyed both of those presentations, actually, and particularly summed up nicely by Noel's question, which really, I think, highlighted the fact that this is, this is about trade-offs. And if you go back to Lazio's point, what are the hard choices that we need to make in order to make a just transition? And I think that both presentations really gave good insight, both from Lazio, very sort of strategic overview, to Zoe's sort of really good pilot projects and explanations, particularly about when things don't work. I think that's a really good point. You have to learn from your mistakes moving forward. But for me, it just showed the sort of interconnectedness of everything and the importance of people and the importance of communicating and the importance of listening, which is something that Zoe also picked up on. It's one thing I kept writing down. It's like we must, if we are going to have a people-based and a place-based set of policies, then we need to ask those questions, and we need to combine that with the data that we're now getting. And the ability we have to understand, and again, Zoe showed that really clearly in her diagrams. We have the capability now of combining both an incredible understanding that we get from data, but we mustn't forget that to ask people and to respond to that. So I found it really, really interesting. And just my final point, which was there's this kind of investment in human capital. And because I really responded to that, something that we're finding a lot in the UK is how do we leverage what we have through our grants and through our investments in terms of making things, making that change. And I think that we do, if we get the policies right, as Lazlo says, we can really make a significant difference. And right back at the beginning, starting with that kind of positivity around things are moving quickly, and we have already made some huge gains. So yeah, I thought both presentations were super interesting, and very grateful to have been here to listen to them. So thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can go a bit back on your background. So as a founding director of the architecture firm dRMM and a design expert, you have a unique perspective on the interaction of infrastructure, design, and inclusion. So first ask you, what initially inspired you to pursue a career in this field, and how was your perspective evolved over the years?
Well,
and maybe you can talk a bit about RRM.
Yeah, no, I will do, and I'll very, very quickly touch upon my upbringing, actually, because Lazlo talked a lot about an aging population, and I had a very different and unusual upbringing. I was brought up in a community that was started by my grandfather, so I wasn't brought up by a nuclear family, a lot of different families, and the rule was that we had a number of families who lived in one big house, one room per person. And we all looked after each other. So I would come home as a young schoolgirl and look after my great grandmother. And every evening, she died when she was 111. She was the oldest woman in Great Britain, and I don't think any thanks to my care. But what that meant was that because there was a coordinated and a collective sense of responsibility in looking after our elderly, she didn't have to go into a care home. And the other thing that I learned was a huge amount of kind of a perspective from a generation that I think taught me a huge amount. So that sort of sense of social inclusion and responsibility, I suppose, was one of the things that I brought into my practice. So I founded dRMM over 25 years ago with Alex de Rijker and Philip Marsh, and I think the one thing that we sort of settled on was the sense that we wanted to do socially useful architecture, and at the heart, put that at the heart of absolutely everything that we designed. And what that means is putting people first, putting people first, and sort of not only their needs, but their kind of lived experience. And I think that's, we did that regardless, I think, of the brief that we were given, or even the project that we were tackling. And I think one of the things, I think I'm going to move you on, if you don't mind, to the first case study, because I know I don't have long, but I wanted to talk about this because this is Hastings Pier. It was a project that we won the Sterling Prize for, which is a very famous architectural prize in the United Kingdom. And it's interesting because this really does exemplify this ethos, I think, and because it's the only project that's ever won that you can't really classify as a building, but more of a kind of community space and a piece of living infrastructure, and one that has been built on the long-term kind of collaboration and inspiration of the people of Hastings, of whom it was built for. So if you go to the next stage, I mean, one of the things that we find fundamental, just going back to many of the points that Zoi and Lazlo picked up on, is the importance of asking. And when it came to Hastings Pier, you know, the community of Hastings is huge. It's, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. So how do you ask everybody, you know, their opinion about a piece of infrastructure that they need to feel a part of? Well, you do that through a huge amount of consultation, and the outcome of which is that we decided that we couldn't actually design a building that would satisfy everybody. So what did we do? We thought, well, we would make a very well we would design a pier which was incredibly well serviced, and which you could do anything on. You could have events, you could have you know, huge events. This is one of the very big events that we had at the end of the opening of the pier. But it can be many things to many people, and I think that was the success of this project. And when you go to Hastings Pier, it has this sort of, it has a real, it has a kind of sense of real sort of spiritualness, and my belief is that has come because it really has been a process of co-design and collaboration that the people of Hastings have been involved in, and it taught me a huge amount, and continues to do so, about the importance of you know, asking people about what it is that they want and what it is that they need.
I suppose what you define when we're preparing this session, social usefulness of light infrastructure.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
You mentioned that at one point when we prepared was social usefulness. So I think it was kind of key also in this definition.
Yeah, so social, I mean, it's about, you only know what is socially useful if you are able to ask communities what it is that they need. And in this case, what it meant was that in order to make a space that was inclusive, and in order to make a space that everybody felt that they were a part of, what that meant was actually, it was about offering a space that could curate events that one could that could be used by everybody in different ways, that was flexible and adaptable. And so it was this sense of I think curation that is really important when it comes to being social. So, you know, creating buildings and an environment that is socially useful.
And I suppose going back to the balance between functionality, aesthetic, inclusivity in your own design, which must be the major challenge from scratch. Maybe I will go back to your background once again. As an advisory role, as a chair of the Independent Design Panel for High Speed 2, and as a commissioner of the National Infrastructure Commission, that has positioned you at the forefront of shaping major infrastructure projects. So my second question would be, how can we integrate universal design principles into infrastructure projects to enhance acceptability for people of all abilities? And can you talk more about your national infrastructure strategy?
For sure. I'm going to, first of all, just if you don't mind moving to the next slide, talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing at High Speed 2, because I think one of the most important things you need to do is get the brief right. And this comes back to asking people, before you start on any project, whether it be a policy, whether it be a piece of infrastructure, whether it be a building, you need to make sure that you get the brief right. And my experience in all the work that I've been doing, particularly with government, is that often things are rushed through very quickly, and you're not given the time. You don't give the time that is needed at that outset to make sure that you have the right kind of framework in place, in order that in the long term you can respond back that vision, if you like, or that set of criteria in order to keep a consistency through the project. So one of the things that we did at HS2 was to set down a design vision. You know, at the time, HS2 was the biggest infrastructure project the UK that was happening in Europe at the time. And in order to, I think, ensure that we are designing and delivering an infrastructure that is inclusive, we need to do that with a really set of clear principles. So this is exactly what we did for High Speed 2. And the other thing that I learned very early on was that actually, if you don't mind going to the next slide, when you are writing specifications and when you are putting down ideas for projects, it's always written. And very rarely do you offer big contractors or engineers the opportunity to understand visually and aesthetically what it is that you are looking forward to. So if you can see on the top here that the grey slide is the design that went through the parliamentary process, and I'm on record saying if it was designed like that, I'd throw myself off of it. So I thought I had to do something in order to make it a little bit better. Because the process was long, and because we were only going out to procure at that moment, I said, why don't we? Rather than just a written specification, put forward an aesthetic specification, a visual specification. So we set up and delivered what we called a specimen design. So we asked an architect to come in and design and deliver with and take the time to communicate and consult with the local community to come up with a design that was that everybody was kind of pleased with, and not only was to time and to budget. And what this meant was that, and you can see on the right, the slides on the right. This is the viaduct, or being constructed at this moment in time. But because we'd gone to the effort of having this. Doing this work early on, it meant that the whole process was smoother, that it wasn't held up in planning disputes or difficult conversations, and therefore put the whole program at risk. It meant that we were able to move forward very quickly with a kind of baseline understanding of what it was, not just in terms of safety specifications and technical specifications, but also a kind of visual specification. And sorry, I interrupted you. Moving forward then to the work that we've been doing at High Speed 2 around inclusivity, this comes also to understanding and talking to really finding ways of allowing those user groups to input meaningfully into the process. And that again is about starting early on. So we at HS2 we had a really good set of kind of focus groups, virtual reality stimulations, live testing sessions with charitable organizations, community groups, individuals with disabilities and protected characteristics. But it was about the user experience as much as anything else. So it was really understanding how in terms of determining, light levels in stations, how wayfinding and signage should be presented, the height and size and placement of seating on trains, platforms, concourse areas. So we talked about this very eloquently, I think, in her presentation. It's about ensuring that you have the ability to make a journey from the moment you decide that you're going to buy a ticket to the moment you come to the end of your journey. So it's all about how easy is it to go online and buy a ticket, and how easy is it therefore from that moment on not to get to the station and then to take your journey to come off to the station, to have the modal transitions that you need to get to your place of to get to the end of your journey. So it's about the whole journey experience, not just the train part of that journey.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. And maybe if we can go to, sorry.
I was just going to talk a tiny little bit about the National Infrastructure Commission, which I think. Oh, we have got that next. Great. So the commission, one of the roles, many of the roles that I do are really focused on design advocacy, but the National Infrastructure Commission was set up by the government to ensure that to advise government on 1.2% of GDP. So it's advising government on its all sectors of its economic infrastructure, and we do this over over a 5-year period. We produce a national infrastructure assessment, which then goes forward to producing a national infrastructure strategy. And when I arrived at the commission, one of the things that I felt really passionate about was to take the experience from the work that we've done at High Speed 2 and do the same thing for the National Infrastructure Commission. And that is to write a set of policies or a design vision, if you like, that all of those involved in designing and delivering our infrastructure could refer back to, because of the success of the High Speed 2 design vision. So we wrote a set of design principles for all infrastructure of national significance, which focused on climate, people, place, and value, as a sort of checklist, if you like, for all of those involved in the delivery of our national infrastructure. Because I'm a great believer that kind of good design is the responsibility of everybody in a project. And also one of the things that I'm very passionate about was the inclusion of the next generation, because the work of the National Infrastructure Commission looks to the 20-30 years. And as I said to my fellow commissioners, as the youngest commissioner, I'll probably be dead in 30 years. So maybe we should think about asking the next generation about their input into the work that we were doing. And for 13 places, we had over 800 people apply for this position. And this was, I think, just shows how important it is for not only, for young people to have a voice when it comes to influencing policy and national policy.
It's very clear. Thank you very much. So I think you have touched also the meaningful engagement and participation of diverse stakeholders. I know you have a few slides about this point in particular, regarding quality of life framework. I'll let you tell us a bit more about it.
Thank you. So I suppose taking on that understanding and learning from infrastructure, I'm also passionately interested in the built environment and how people live. And I suppose the understanding of what it is about people's lived experience that really matters. So there was a great debate in the UK about, should we be building traditional or modern, architect design homes? And as an architect, I have to say I was shot down by saying, actually, I don't think it matters. And that actually what matters is, what actually matters to people's, what is it that actually matters to people in order that we can improve the quality of their life through our built environment. So during lockdown, I went around all the big developers and I said, give me some money. I think you have a responsibility to ask these questions and to ensure that we're designing and delivering our built environment and our homes in a way that is actually reflective of what people want and need, and also about how that improves their quality of life. And we produced a quality of life framework, which is on the next slide. And it's there is absolutely no surprises here. What is it that gives, makes people feel like they have a better quality of life? Well, it's the fact that they have a sense of control. And I think, that things aren't done to them. And I think that came out very well in both the earlier presentations, people need to feel that they have some say in what is happening to them. A sense of belonging and community is so important. It was the highlight of the whole of this survey. People want to feel that they are part of a community, that they are included, that they are involved. Freedom of movement, I think that plays very nicely to Zoe's one of her graphs, which said actually that how equity was all around connectivity. Well, this is absolutely true. We need to be able to be free to move around our conurbations in a way that is affordable and practicable. Nature, access to nature. Well, there's no surprise there, but it's incredibly important that we are designing and delivering places where we have access to nature, and that we're doing so, and that we're building healthy homes, which is an obvious statement, but where the air is clean and we're building sustainably. And then finally, a sense of fun and wonder. How important it is that we all enjoy and have a kind of opportunity for culture, for joy, for playfulness. And we're not just talking about children, but grown-ups too. And then the final slide was some work that we've done around community consultation, and one of the pieces of work that we have done shows that actually there is no standard for good community consultation. So we worked with universities across the UK to come up with a way of merging both digital and face-to-face consultation to come up with maps, community maps of their local areas, where they themselves highlighted places and spaces that improve their quality of lives. And over time now, what we're doing is going back to those communities and asking them if and when developments are happening, whether or not those things have changed. And we're overlaying socioeconomic data in order to see that if social value is something, and social equity in particular is something that is improving in those areas.
It's really interesting, and I'm very glad that we had that conversation with you. It's clear, and that's also why really Thomas chose to have you on this panel too. It's your commitment to building sustainable and equitable environments is outstanding. It's very clear. And you have clearly emphasized the importance of considering urban planning from an inclusive perspective. And that's one of our key topics, is how to make the city of tomorrow, the city we all want to live in a sustainable way. So it may be in a few minutes because we are close to the end. Do you have some practical steps or strategies that cities can adopt to ensure inclusivity in their development phase?
Sure. I think just to reflect on that, often, when we talk about these big issues, they can be so overwhelming, they can be so difficult to comprehend, and they need so many different players and factors to all kind of combine in order to make everything better. But I think sometimes there are certain things that you can do, and if you go to the next slide, very, very simple things. How do you get people back onto streets and actively walking? Well, you make those streets a more pleasant place to be. You ensure that you have places where you can sit. You ensure that they're well lit, that they're not going to be run over by cars, scooters, or bicycles. That that there are ways in which that we navigate between all of those needs, and to Nawal's point, that we are able to include spaces that work for young people and old people. It's about how do we do that inclusively. And if you go to the next slide, I think this is a really wonderful example of, when we look at big infrastructure and the overall strategy needed about making our infrastructure more efficient, then we need to think hard about, where do we put our solar farms, in order that we're not devastating our farming land. We need to ensure that we're putting heat to waste to heat plants nearby communities that can use and resource that heat. You know, we need to make sure that we have a kind of integrated strategy. And then if you look at the micro level, this can be done so simply by, you know, how do you reduce flooding in our cities? A big issue for London. Well, you do so environmentally by thinking about putting suds and better drainage in a way that brings nature back into our cities. So I think that there's real opportunities to combine and think about how we implement our kind of big infrastructure and small infrastructure, and do so in a way that does improve people's quality of life.
So thank you very much. We're getting really close to the end. I will give you the final word on those three presentations. Any specific thoughts you would like to share to conclude?
Yeah, I think in conclusion, I think when, you know, I'd like to just say that I don't think our built environment, our infrastructure means anything without people, and without them, you know, they're kind of empty follies, almost vacant of any of the things that we associate with the beauty of just being alive. So I think what I take as a common thread through all of my work, and in fact the work that we've seen and the conversations that we've had today, is that we do need to have a new understanding of community, and that community doesn't always look like what you've been told it should. You know, it's still a set of people that live in our immediate vicinity, in the buildings in our street, but community is also about people who will never meet or will never know, and the people whose connection that you build on through the things that you share and the spaces that you share. So, and I think that's why, for me as designers and makers, it's those small decisions that we make every day about how to make a building, a bridge, a tower, or a master plan the best that they could be. And it's more about ensuring that we are building design excellence, and that once again, and without upending, I suppose, what we've been taught to take as the definition of community, challenging as it is, and then insist, you know, that people and you know, place-based, people-based, to go back to Lazio's point earlier, is at the absolute heart of everything that we all try to do.
Thank you very much. It's not time to the end of our panel. Thank you to all of you. I don't know, Gwenola, if you are still online with us, if you want to give a last word.
Yes, of course. Well, I just wanted to thank all the speakers. It was amazing, and we were so delighted because you helped really frame, I think, the whole debate about inclusion and infrastructure, how it has to be incorporated from the design perspective and then overall the life of the infrastructure. And therefore, this is going to be set in the stone for all the organization of the future workshop panels. And Thomas, if you want to remind, or Gwen, the different dates that have been already put in the agenda, so that everybody which might be interested to follow the discussion have in mind in its calendar the different steps forward.
Yes, thank you, Gwenola, and thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to our three great guests. Yes, regarding next steps, we are organizing through Infravision and with Vauban a series of podcasts on how to accelerate the transition to a more inclusive infrastructure, and highlighting the best practices in the industrial world and within different kind of infrastructure. So that will be over the next 3 months. And we'll organize also a panel on what are the regulatory and business levels that you can activate to create shared value with an academic expert and other CEOs and industrials. That will be on May 14, and then all of this will lead to the writing of a long-form report that will be presented during the Infra Week in November. During a large conference organized by Vauban.
It's I mean, similar to the previous year, the work, I mean, all the work we're doing here through the workshop, the podcast, the panel, is of course to build up on the knowledge around the topic. We believe that no other research that's kind of been done around this topic, and it's extremely interesting to have your views because it helps us also to build up, and we may get back to you and ask you for some support also in the report writing. The idea is to have something that is useful for all. Here, like Thomas was saying, the research is on that open platform named Infravision. The idea is, of course, to have it open to all stakeholders in the infrastructure sector, from the industry to the public authorities to the academics, but also to the citizens who are using our infrastructure. Like Sadie said, our infrastructure without the people are useless. So I believe this annual theme around inclusive infrastructure is very timely and should be key in our process of making infrastructure sector more sustainable. So thank you very much to all of you, and looking forward to continue the discussion with you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.